my favourite female comic is Sindugi. Oh my god.
Philomena Kunk. That's all I have to say.
Aisling B, the love of my life, one of the most beautiful women in the entire world, hilarious. She was recently on a great podcast, Rule of Three. She was on a podcast called Rule of Three where she talked about Father Ted, which is one of my favourite shows. We have so much in common. We should meet. Aisling, if you're watching this, I'm in love with you. I think This Way Up was the best show ever made.
French and Saunders. Obviously French and Saunders.
Or Tamsin Gregg, can I count her?
Hannah Gadsby is tragically hilarious. Both of her shows, Nanette and Douglas, had me howling with laughter. Howling. But also crying at the same time.
Amy Schumer is fun.
It's got to be French and Saunders or Catherine Tate. They're just iconic.
And Sarah Pascoe.
Natasha Dimitri was another great comic. She is an alumni of the Bristol Reunions. She is probably most notable for playing Natasha in What We Do in the Shadows. I love how silly she is. When she's in a cast with all other men, she steps up to the plate and is just as stupid as they are. She's great, hilarious, beautiful as well.
Joanna Lumley with Jennifer Saunders as well, and absolutely fabulous. They are hilarious, they work so well together.
Female comics are just generally beautiful, lovely people. Shocking.
Favourite woman playing a male part?
Oh.
I don't know, actually.
This is like a very obvious one, and it's quite similar to like my experience of doing Twelfth Night, because I did the same thing. But when Tamsin Gregg played Malvolio.
Oh, I have to be really, really basic, and it's Twelfth Night, and it's Tamsin Gregg doing Malvolio.
But they did change the part, so it wasn't Malvolio anymore. She wasn't like playing a man like in a pantomime like when I did it. They changed the name to Malvolio. Oh, wasn't it Malvolia? Yeah, Malvolia, and it was a female Malvolio played by Tamsin Gregg.
It was brilliant. She was so good, and I just admire that show so much. National Theatre, 12th Night.
I feel like it added a different depth to the character, kind of making her infatuation and love for Olivia, obviously like a homosexual romance. I feel like it did add a different vibe and kind of made the ending a bit sadder for Malvolia, but in the original play, you're not supposed to feel bad for Malvolio at all. Like, he's just a bit of a knob. You know, he's just a Puritan. He's very fusty. He kind of just wants to be with Olivia for her money and so that he can be a lord.
Well, I actually really loved in the Bridge Theatre's Midsummer Night's Dream when they gender swapped Oberon and Titania. I thought it did something really interesting to their power dynamic.
I really like the inverted taming of the shrew, because obviously shrew, and if you take the script as it is, obviously it's very problematic. I believe from photos that I've seen, it was set kind of around the court of Elizabeth I, or like alluded to quite strongly, where they essentially kind of like flipped it around. Horatio was played by a female and Kate was played by a male, because that really does make you think about Taming of the Shrew, kind of like the script itself, the raw Shakespeare as it were.
Or Maxine Peaker's Hamlet, because she's so good.
Probably Maxine Peaker's Hamlet. Hamlet's just such like a wet, annoying teenager. He's great, like moping around. I think she does it really, really well.
It's not on a stage show, but I actually really enjoyed Helen Mirren playing Prospero in The Tempest. I watched it for this, and I'm not the biggest fan of The Tempest, but I really liked what it sort of did to the character. I think Prospero could be a very, very dislikable character, and particularly as like this figure of male power, of like controlling his daughter. I really liked how having Prospero played by women sort of changed that dynamic a bit and made it a mother-daughter relationship. Equally, I think it adds something interesting to the whole story of Prospero being banished, because if Prospero is played by a woman who has been pushed out of power by a group of men, it does change that dynamic a bit. It changes what that story is saying, and I think that's something that they could have actually afforded to play more into. It's also, honestly, I just want Helen Mirren to play everyone.
My favourite example of a woman playing a traditionally male part has to be Fiona Shaw in Richard II. The 1997 production was a really important thing for me to see because playing with gender in that play specifically completely changes the tone of the play. So by casting Richard II as a woman, it helped make the play deal with more of the sensual and the sexual side of his relationships with men, and it's kind of it was seen as okay because it was a woman and a man, but Fiona was playing a man. It's very confusing. It's a really good production and I really like it. Fiona Shaw is just a marvel. The way that she can convey such sorrow and such like emptiness and such heartbreak so powerfully is incredible, and I just love her.
I really enjoyed the all-female King Richard as well. I think that was good. Because again, kind of like while watching it, because everyone was a woman, I kind of forgot that like it was done by all women, if that makes sense. It wasn't something that I was thinking about actively through the play. I was just enjoying a really bloody good production of Richard III. And I think that's when kind of like having gender bent roles is most impressive, is when you forget it's been gender bent and you just enjoy the character as it is. Like, I don't want to go watch a Shakespeare and the entire time be sat there being like, oh, well, that's interesting. Shylock's normally played by a man. Like, obviously having bits where you make kind of like gender parallels is fine. But I think, you know, gender is bigger than that and Shakespeare is bigger than that. I just want to see whoever is going to be the best Shylock play Shylock. I don't give a toss about like their genitalia. I just want to see them really inhabit that character to give an interesting interpretation, give a good performance.
Ooh. Oh.
Oh,
I so badly wanted to see a goddamn production with a sexy female Tybalt. Oh!
It could be kind of fun to see Romeo played by a woman.
A really badass female Tybalt, like, I'm talking stilettos, leather jacket, red lipstick, just like, I just think it could be done by a woman so well, because you could make more of a sense of camaraderie between Juliet and Tybalt, and then, you know, it's sisterhood, and the reason Tybalt is being such an arse is not just because she's a bit of an arse, but it's because she's being super overprotective of her younger cousin. She can see that Romeo is a bit of a simp. He's a bit wet. Also, he's a bit dodgy because he's like 16 and Juliet's, what, 13, 14?
Compared to Juliet, who's quite pure with her love and quite, you know, quite open and quite romantic, he's more lustful. So it could be an interesting dynamic to have that be a woman.
I want to see like a strong, empowered, female, sexy Tybalt who's like a biker chick and just totally badass.
If you had like a female Romeo and a female Juliet, that would be so cool, because then you could like experiment with the dynamics of like Romeo tempting Juliet kind of into this like lesbian relationship, and kind of all the dynamics of that. That could be quite fun.
I mean, I've seen it before, but I want to see it again. Puck played by a woman. I love it.
Another way around, I'd quite like to see a male Kate in Taming of the Shrew, and see. I don't really mind about the prosciutto, it could be any sex, but I'd quite like to see how a male Kate would do the submissive and this kind of stuff. So slight opposite end of what we're being asked right now.
I know it's really boring and they've already done it, but like Helena, Midsummer Night's Dream, there was a play where they did that and they made Helena Helenus. So his infatuation with Demetrius, again, has kind of like a homosexual, obviously, dynamic to it. And the lines of like, I cannot love you, just have like a completely different meaning when you make it like a kind of homosexual, forbidden romance, that kind of thing.
I'd like to see how a female Henry V would do St. Crispin's Day, because that is such a traditionally male part. And it's about being a warrior, and it's about being X, Y, Z. It's less about actually the part, it's more about I'd like to see the production in which a woman being Henry V made sense, and where they made that decision and why they made that decision, because I can't see how that might work.
So I'd quite like to see Macbeth as a woman. Because go big or go home. I don't know if it would be good or not, but I really want to see what it would be like.
I want to see more badass women in Shakespeare. The idea of female Tybalt with just that power.
I like seeing how the power dynamic changes when you put a woman into a role which was traditionally seen as a masculine power role. I like seeing really masculine characters played by women, because I think the minute you take the masculinity out of the character a bit, or you have a woman trying to play up to that, it just changes the narrative.
If anyone is watching this and is thinking of putting on a production of Romeo and Juliet, for the love of God, make a female Tybalt, or a female presenting Tybalt. I think it would be an excellent addition to the canon.
Make them all women.
I have seen a woman playing Jaques before. I saw The Guardian did a series of monologues where like a celebrity would read a famous Shakespeare monologue, and Zor Ashton, who played Vod in Fresh Meat, absolute cracking actress. She did The Ages of a Man speech that Jaques does, and As You Like It. And that's the first time I really heard that speech, done properly, was by her. And it was really, really good. And I felt like Jaques is a bit different just because he's quite melancholy. That's his kind of main character trait, and I kind of feel like that kind of works as a woman and a man.
I don't think I've seen Dogberry played by a woman, mainly because of how ridiculous he is.
I have seen Feste performed as a woman before, and I didn't like how she did it. And to be honest, that's pretty healthy, I'd say. You know, all groundbreaking and all that kind of stuff, but in the end we're all actors, and so we should be able to say, yeah, I saw this and I didn't like this particular portrayal. Because in that particular production there was a real emphasis on the female court of Olivia and the male court of Orsino. But I think sometimes we really do need to admit and realise that true equality will only happen, especially in this kind of gender bending world and in all this kind of stuff, when we can say, absolutely, I disliked your performance. I think it's great that you were played by it, but there we are.
Generally in comedy, women are always the straight man, and they're always going, oh, you fellas, look at what you've done. Ah, well, I never. But because he is so silly and so ridiculous and so over the top, giving that role to a woman isn't common, because women aren't seen as these silly, stupid, prattling, pratfalling, doing slapstick comedy. Women generally don't do slapstick comedy. They don't do being an idiot. They don't do just pure, unadulterated silliness. So that's probably why he's never been seen as a woman before.
I don't think I've actually seen Ariel played by a woman before. I'm aware that there's a Christopher Plummer version of The Tempest with Ariel, but I only know that because I googled it. And Ariel's played by a woman in that. I think it really, really works. Ariel is kind of completely genderless in that production, but very childlike. A lot of the time that's the way you do kind of genderless. You go straight to childlike, because when you're a child, the gender stuff isn't as big of a deal. And it worked quite well because they were singing kind of in the really high-pitched voice, and it actually made that particular directing choice make a lot of sense. But she didn't do it it didn't mean it was any more feminine. It was still a genderless character. It didn't make a difference that she was a woman. She was just a really good actress. There's a thing with Ariel, they seem to always cast him as a boy, and I don't see why, because they really explicitly don't have a gender, and there aren't many female characters in The Tempest, so you could really afford to maybe cast a woman if they're the best for the role, obviously.
No, actually. Feste in particular, because it's so much this career fool, and this idea of a man who is on the outside anyway. I think that being a woman doesn't input that. I actually don't think many of the fools are very gendered. And much of it is about his skill with words and the skill of this, and also the fact that he is an enigma and also transcends. So if we're playing it in a traditional role, in terms of setting it in Elizabethan times, actually him, Feste being played by a woman, would also fit into this idea of being the outsider.
I do feel that reading this as a female comic changes the meaning. Mainly because Dogberry is like a character that has some status but not a lot. He's in charge of the night police, so he's at this like elevated level compared to the rest of the characters. By putting a woman in that position, you get to play with the sort of the gender dynamics of a woman leading an all-male team. Or maybe they're not an all-male team. Maybe they're all women being the police force within the city. We don't know. Anyway, yeah, playing with the gender dynamics of a woman leader is always interesting. I think you can explore more of like the insecurities of Dogberry in terms of his position of leadership and how he deals with that. Also, kind of the rambling nature of his speech is something that I think can be works as a woman, because you're kind of like, you're always trying to justify yourself when you're rambling constantly, which is what Dogberry is doing in this speech.
I think the fantastic thing about Bottom specifically is that he's a really universal character. In that, like, everyone knows a Bottom. Everyone knows someone who kind of like is a bit of a diva, and probably doesn't take it like as far as he does, but like I think everyone can see aspects of him either in themselves or kind of like in the people around them. And I don't think that it's kind of like particularly gendered. I don't think it has to be read by a man in order to be funny. I don't really think about the gender of Bottom, because like he transforms into a donkey. If we're kind of splitting straws, splitting hairs, that's not really like kind of like the most interesting aspect of him. I think perhaps like the heteronormative relationship with Titania is where the being male like becomes important. So I don't think that kind of like as a female comic I'm gonna change anything. I would just play Bottom for Bottom. Like, he's such a unique character. He's so well beloved. He talks to the audience so much. I don't think his gender has to play an important role. I think what makes him special, what makes him so lovable and laughable is aspects separate to that. So I would kind of just play him for him rather than thinking about like what's going on in his pants, because at the end of the day it doesn't really matter if he's a man or a woman. What matters is that he's really, really funny and that we can relate to him.
I mean, with Ariel, it's a bit of a weird one because they don't have a gender. So, no, I don't feel like it changes the meaning. I don't feel like it should change the meaning. I kind of feel like if it does change the meaning, that's more to do with someone else reacting to it being a woman than like any intrinsic gender to the character, because there just isn't any. Ariel is this kind of sprite. They're not even human, so the character can be so many things, and the only things that really have to stay the same is that they're odd and magical and incredibly powerful and fast, none of which are very limited to gender.
And I'd have to say my honest answer to this is no, but I think that's because I've done a lot of pantomimes, stuff like that, and those are the kind of plays where kind of doesn't really matter whether you're like a boy or a girl. It doesn't mean that you can't play a certain part. Like, most of the parts that I've played have been men. So like I've recently played Malvolio, who is a Shakespearean fool, in a play. So I've never felt like, oh, I can't play the fool because I'm a woman, because I literally have played one. So I guess for me it's a bit different. I just didn't really see it as being that different. But I can appreciate for other people it may well be quite different.
I have a hot take on this. I think it's because men are afraid to let women be funny. So often when you get a male director of a play, they will cast the men as the funny role because they are scared of letting the women be funny. They are scared of letting the women loose on the play and bringing a new perspective to it.
I think while obviously society's come on a really long way when it comes to gender roles and gender stereotyping of the last couple of years, I think ultimately there's still a lot of like really ingrained ideas surrounding gender politics, I guess, is the best phrase for it.
I think there is also a thing about women and being funny. I think that's changing.
Oh, women can't be funny. Women can't be employed as a jester. That kind of dealio.
I think it is a bit of this thing. Women are sometimes seen as more gendered than men, so men are allowed a lot more variety in their roles, and there's a little bit of like, it's like the old attitude of women were viewed as just women, like you could only play a woman.
I know as a female comic, I'm often put into the role of wife, mother, girlfriend, someone who's on the sidelines while the other characters take the spotlight.
From personal experience, I once, very last minute, had to cover for a dame in a pantomime. In that the actual dame was sick, I was directing, and I was the only person available who knew the blocking, roughly. And one thing I can say is that when a woman dresses up as a dame and is sexually provocative to male audience members, it's not funny, it's just awkward. Like, I gave it a good crack, and a lot of the jokes just didn't land because the audience just weren't feeling it.
It's habit. We tend to, when we imagine stuff, when we do productions, we tend to partly be basing it on what we've seen before and what we thought of that. And if you only ever saw versions of a show where all the characters, where all the fools in particular, all the comic characters are men, you would get this picture of the comic in your mind as a man, and therefore when you're casting a comedic role, you cast a man.
When you put a woman into the role of a fool, they are in the spotlight. Shakespeare's fools aren't ever in the background. They're constantly centre of stage, making people laugh. They are probably the most liked by the audience. They're the ones interacting the most with the audience in order to make them laugh and be happy. So by letting that be a woman, I think that makes men scared.
A lot of the directors are still men. Like the production side of theatre is diversifying a bit now, but it's taking its time. A particular film as well.
There's not many directors that I know of personally who just cast a female comic over a male because they were the ones who did best in the audition. Normally it is because they are trying to say something greater.
Yeah, I think because it's not quite so much of a statement. I always get this impression with productions. If they change the gender of a character, it often is either a messenger character to bring up equality, or it's a big statement character like changing King Lear or Hamlet. Whereas a character like this, it isn't a big enough statement, it isn't a big enough thing, and so often gets overlooked. Because quite often when you're gender bending in Shakespeare, it's often made the biggest thing of a production, and if so, then you want to go for a more important character than you do this kind of character.
The issue is you can either cast a female Malvolio, and it's Malvolia, like Tamsin Greig in the recent production by the National Theatre, or it is just a woman playing the male Malvolio. So there's all these kind of like decisions that you have to make before you even think about the audition process. The problem is, like in commercial theatre, when you're pitching your idea for like investment packages and stuff, you can't just be like, we'll see what happens. Normally they're going to want you to have a USP, a unique selling point, and like a reason to cast female over male or male over female, as the case may be, simply because that then gives them kind of like a thing to advertise, a thing to kind of like hook onto, as it were.
It's an interesting one because they are so gender neutral. I can't think of many fools. I mean, apart from the obvious base fool, the kind of the commedia dell'arte character who is driven by base sexual desire, where it's very, very obvious that he's male in a certain dick-pointing way. But otherwise, I think it's because they fall in that in-between of not being so unimportant that it doesn't matter who plays them, and it's not so important that it becomes the entire character. I think it's changing. I think that embracing gender blindness is becoming more and more frequent as people realise how little it matters. That being said, it depends also on how you play gender in Shakespeare, because sometimes gender is highly important and you should be focusing in that, and it depends on the production.
Well, I feel like the Shakespearean fools, they're always male characters, And I feel like the kind of blanket answer that I feel like everybody would give is just, because sexism. And, like, that is definitely a factor. Do not get me wrong. But I do feel like another angle is that when you notice the kind of traditional fools, like Jaques and like Feste, they're often very, very witty, and they outwit people around them, and they have a much better view, more realistic view of the world, and they kind of like, they have a good point most of the time. And I kind of think for those characters, maybe there's an element of that's who Shakespeare sees himself as. And obviously, you know, you see this a lot where like authors will kind of like write characters that are similar to themselves into their books, like George R. R. Martin with Samuel Tarly. And like, I kind of think Shakespeare probably sees himself as this like kind of, people see him as the fool, but really he's smarter than everybody else in the room, but they all think he's an idiot, but he knows what's going on.
Yeah. I disagree with this idea that it has to be this big part of the show. It'd be very fun to play around with just having a character who is a female in a very interesting play, which is interesting for another reason.
I don't see why there is any character in Shakespeare which you can't have played by a woman. Not necessarily played as a woman, but it's different. I think when these are plays that we all know were initially men playing women, because those were the rules, it's sort of like, I don't think that Shakespeare is that bothered about a bit of drag. I don't think he'll mind. And I don't think he'd mind if it was the other way around either. With Shakespeare, you do get a certain amount of freedom because obviously it's been long enough. It's not that people are going to be like, well, this has just confused my whole understanding of the play. I mean, we're not going to strip off on stage. So, like, if we're dressed as men, you're in a theatre. Suspend your disbelief.
So yeah, lots of interesting points when you play the fool.